thing we're going to do is just review photosynthesis a little bit. Let me make sure. I feel paranoid. Let me fix this.
The ATP is fully gone. ATP.
Yeah, but we're getting there. Okay, so remember, this is how we started photosynthesis, and I told you this is how we'll start respiration. All cells need energy, and we divide that into 2 steps, or I've made these arbitrary steps for you to help you remember. Okay, step 1 is to get your food energy, and step 2 is to convert that energy into ATP. And last year I wrote it a little bit differently. Your step 1 is not written exactly like that, and that's okay. Remember, our food contains carbs, lipids, proteins, but carbohydrates are the main thing. When we're talking about energy, carbohydrates are the main source of energy. Our bodies can use protein and fat in the process glycolysis that we're going to learn tomorrow. It's actually several steps. And there's places where proteins and fats can enter that cycle and be used for energy as well. But we're focusing on carbohydrates because that's our main source of energy, and that's what plants make. Okay, so look, we did the step 1 last week. Our first step is to get our food energy to make carbohydrates or to eat carbohydrates. You've got your photosynthesis equation there. I forgot to finish this out. Yours should be finished out like this. Okay, what side is this? Okay, remember that's your reactant side. This is your product side. What's the purpose? And what organelle? Chloroplast. Okay, now look at your little box and tell me what is the energy source for photosynthesis? Sunlight. Okay, but that sunlight can't be used directly. It's not in your formula, but can you tell me what energy carriers it's stored in? ATP and NADPH is the long one. So it's stored in energy carriers, and from there it goes to the light-dependent stage to make glucose. Look at your formula and tell me what your carbon source for glucose is. Good. CO2 is your carbon source. So remember, you got to think of photosynthesis in 2 parts. Okay, storing the energy source is light, and then using carbon from carbon dioxide to make glucose. So now we're moving on to step 2, which is how we convert food energy. Remember, we're focusing on carbs into usable energy in the form of ATP. Okay, notice this box goes all the way across, and the reason why is because plants and animals both do this process. All living organisms, no matter how you get your carbohydrates, you have to convert that into a form that the cell can use. And I'll explain why a little bit later today. But that process is called respiration. Aerobic means with oxygen, okay? So you couldn't do photosynthesis, right? But you can do respiration. When we breathe, the purpose of having the gases that we breathe in is so that our cells can use them to make energy. So we can think about it on an organism level. You can think about what you breathe in and what you breathe out. But really, it's every single one of your cells that need to take in what? What gas do you need to take in? Oxygen. Every single one of your cells needs to take in oxygen and release what? Carbon dioxide. And that's what your bloodstream does. Okay, so your heart pumps, okay, the blood through your lungs. The oxygen is absorbed into your bloodstream. The bloodstream carries it to every cell in your body. Okay, at the same time, your cells are releasing carbon dioxide back into the blood. It's traveling to your lungs. It's going back out. So if you think about what you do when you breathe, that'll help you remember this equation. So remember, when we start this, reason your way through it. You're going to start with the gas that you need. What is the gas that you need to breathe in? Oxygen. Okay, so oxygen is going to be the first thing that goes in. Now, the next thing we're going to write here is our energy source going in. What is the energy source that we are converting to ATP? Look at carbs, right? Carbs. So that's going to be glucose. Remember, the colors just are to help keep you focused and to help you Memorize it. They're not required if you hate it. Okay, now for this side of the equation, think about the gas that you breathe out. What gas do you breathe out? Carbon dioxide. Okay, your second, that says carbon dioxide. Your next thing, this is a stretch. This isn't actually what's happening, but it helps me remember, so maybe it'll help you. When you breathe out in the winter, you know how you can see your breath? Why can you see your breath?
Because it's hot.
It contains moisture. It contains water. So we breathe out water too. Again, that's not exactly what's happening, but it can help you remember. Okay? So H2O, water. And then what I'm missing is the whole reason I'm doing it in the first place. Nope. ATP. So my last thing is ATP. And for aerobic respiration, which is what this formula is, and it's the only one you know right now, it's 36 ATP. Let me get my kapow bubble. It's a lot of energy. Kapow. ATP. It is photosynthesis flipped. Okay, so I'll explain to you why. But before I explain to you the why, think about this. You already know the formula for photosynthesis, right?
Yes.
So do you know the formula for respiration?
No.
Yes, you just need to flip it and add what?
ATP.
Just flip it and add ATP, and you know the equation. But I want you to know why it works that way. I'm going to say it the fancy way and then the easier way. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants of respiration. The products of respiration are the reactants of photosynthesis. It's a cycle. So in other words, what comes out of photosynthesis, what? Goes into respiration. And what comes out of respiration? Goes into photosynthesis. Okay, and the reason for this is because aerobic organisms have evolved and adapted to use oxygen. So photosynthesis was the first process, and respiration is a process that's adapted to follow and use the products of photosynthesis. And we'll hopefully get to talk about that a little bit later in the year. But if you know one, you know the other. What comes out of photosynthesis goes into respiration. Now, so looking at this is a common misconception. Do plants release carbon dioxide?
Yes.
Yes, because they have to do respiration, right? But here's the deal, and you guys had a question like this on your factors affecting photosynthesis worksheet. Photosynthesis removes more carbon dioxide than they release. So even though plants are releasing CO2, overall they're removing more CO2 than they're releasing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got that.
Okay, so yes, they release CO2, but they remove more CO2 for photosynthesis. Okay, we need to add our last little things on this. This side should still be called what? Reactants. I probably shouldn't have written in yellow. You guys do what you want, but I'm going to change my color here. This is the reactants. Okay, or it might be called the raw materials or the source because it's what's going in. And this side is still the products. So you don't flip-flop because where the words are changed. The reactants are always on the left. That's what goes in. Products always on the right. What comes out, okay? What's your purpose? Okay, your purpose is to make ATP. And then the last thing we need to write is the organelle. And this is the most well-known organelle of them all. It's the one you'll remember when you're 35. What is it? Mitochondria.
That's so funny, Jody.
So that is our overall equation. Our purpose is to make what?
ATP.
ATP. Our purpose is to make ATP, but it actually happens in a series of smaller steps that we're going to learn tomorrow. Just like photosynthesis is a summary reaction, but how many parts are there to it? 2. Light dependent and light independent, right? Respiration is actually like 3 steps, 4 steps if you count the link reaction. So it's a more complicated process. But the reason why is because glucose is a lot of energy. It's more energy than the cell can handle if you release it all at once. Releasing all the energy of glucose at once in the cell is like detonating a bomb. Okay, the cell would explode. So what happens is you have a series of steps that we're going to learn tomorrow that release the energy a little bit at a time and store it in ATP and other energy carriers so that the cell can A, use it, and B, contain it, because glucose has a lot of energy. Okay, but before we talk about that, we need to talk about why ATP is the form of energy used by the cell. Okay, and it's probably the least difficult thing we're going to do in the next couple days, so make sure you're listening so you've got the base. Okay, you guys need this. So ATP, you already know ATP is an energy carrier because we talked about it with photosynthesis. It's an energy carrier in photosynthesis, but it's also an energy carrier used throughout the cell. It has 3 parts. Okay, the first part is adenine. Okay, I'm trying my best to write legibly, but that's ADENINE. And this is actually a nitrogenous base that is also part of DNA. Okay, so we will talk about it again when we talk about DNA. This is a sugar. This is the sugar ribose. How do you know it's a sugar? Ending in OSE. Okay, so adenine and ribose together are called adenosine. You see that word down there? Okay, but that's not, all of the molecule is important, but that's not the part of the molecule we're going to spend the most time talking about. Adenosine triphosphate. What does the prefix tri mean? 3. Okay, so this is called triphosphate because it has 3 phosphates. Okay, and there is energy in bonds. You guys remember that? When you make a bond, you're storing energy. There's energy in bonds. This is the bond that we're going to mostly be concerned with. This right here is my high energy bond. Here's how I think about it. It takes energy to put 2 molecules together. Remember, electrons are what forms bonds, and you can kind of think about electrons as energy for right now. Okay, but when I make a bond, I store energy. It takes a lot of energy to push those 2 phosphates together to make a bond. And the way I think of it, have you ever tried to push the wrong sides of 2 magnets together? How'd that go for you? Okay, it usually won't work. We can't quite get enough energy to push it together, right? But that's what putting phosphates together is like. That's how much energy it stores. It's like pushing 2 magnets together. And also for that reason, ATP is not stable for long periods of time. It's only good for a short period of time. It doesn't stay together over long periods of time. Okay, but that is my high energy molecule. It's like a charged battery. Okay, so if making the bond stored the energy, how am I going to release the energy? Breaking the bond. Okay, so to get from ATP to ADP, to release my energy, I'm going to break a bond. Yes. I'm ready to release this energy. I break a bond. Is that going to add or remove a phosphate? Okay. I'm going to do this a little different than I did in the last class. We're going to write it kind of like a flow chart. Breaking a bond removes a phosphate. Do you want me to write out phosphate, or do you want me to use a P with the circle like you'll see in the diagram? I'll do both. I got both. I got you. So, last thing, is that storing energy or releasing energy? Releasing. Okay? So, look, what are you left with? When you take a phosphate away, what's left? How many phosphates? 2. Okay? That's why this molecule is called diphosphate. Okay, look at your battery. Does this molecule still contain some energy? It does, but most of the time, your body's not going to use the energy in those 2 phosphates. It's going to go ahead and recharge. Okay, when the cell is really low on energy, it will break down ADP for energy. What do you think it's called when you remove another phosphate? What is a word for single? Prefix. Monophosphate. But it is a thing. Okay, but for right now in here, cells usually go ahead and recharge the battery. Go ahead and take it back to ATP. How am I going to get from ADP to ATP? I'm going to add a phosphate, which is going to do what? Make a bond or break a bond? Make a bond. Okay, so if I make a bond, I am adding a phosphate. Okay, and if I add a phosphate, am I storing energy or releasing energy? Storing energy. And y'all, efficiency is a big theme in biology. Storing the energy this way is efficient because when the cell is storing energy, does it have to make an entire molecule? No, the base is already there. Instead of forming many bonds, I'm only forming how many bonds to store this energy? Just one. Okay, just one bond is all that has to be formed. So this is very efficient for the cell. Okay, you break one bond to release energy. You build a bond to store energy. The whole process doesn't have to be reinvented every time. The whole molecule doesn't have to be made. Just one bond needs to be formed. Okay, where in the cell do you need energy? Where do you guys know? Because we've already talked about it. We just talked about transport. Active transport requires energy, right? Active transport requires energy. But there are lots of other things in the cell that require energy. Building proteins, which is pretty much your whole cell's life, is building proteins. Building proteins requires energy. Copying DNA requires energy. Making RNA from DNA requires energy. Rebuilding organelles requires energy. So there are lots of places that ATP can be broken down. Okay, there are also 3 that I can think of right now, places where ADP is converted back to ATP. You've learned about one of them already. In photosynthesis, is there ATP? Yeah. In the light reactions, right? So in the chloroplast, ATP, this step, ADP to ATP, one place it happens is in the chloroplast. And I'm pointing that out because this is also sometimes a misconception. ATP is made, but is that the purpose of photosynthesis? No, and we're talking about like 2 ATP, okay, for every round of photosynthesis. Right here, we're talking about 36 ATP, a lot of energy is what we're talking about right now. But one place that it can happen is in the chloroplast. Some ATP is also made just in your cytoplasm. So in the jelly of the cell, okay, outside of organelles, ATP can be made. But the main place we're going to talk about ATP being made is where? Where inside the cell? What organelle? Mitochondria. Okay, so I'm going to write this here, but I want you to keep in mind this isn't the only place ATP can be made. But this organelle is dedicated solely to this. Okay? In the mitochondria is one of the main places that we're going to discuss ATP being made. It can be made in a couple other places, like the chloroplast and the cytoplasm. But the sole purpose of the mitochondria is to make ATP. And that's what we'll focus on tomorrow. You have part of respiration that does happen in the cytoplasm, but the majority of ATP, the majority of respiration happens inside the mitochondria, and that's tomorrow. Okay, so tell me, what has more energy, ATP or ADP? ATP. Okay, how do I release energy from ATP? Okay, which bond, which phosphate? 1, 2, or 3? Yep, the third phosphate releases the most energy. Okay, and then to restore ATP, to store the energy again, what do I need to do? Make a bond, add a phosphate. Why can't, I just mentioned this, it's not written up here, but it's a question on your reading guide that people are struggling with. Why can the cell not make tons of ATP at one time? Say it again. Well, if I completely break down glucose, that'll blow it up. But with ATP, it's because it's not stable for long periods of time. It's such a high energy carrier that it's not stable. Okay, so it is an excellent energy carrier in the short term, but it is a battery that has to be recharged frequently.